All right, social class. One of the big topics that always comes up when people are talking about the novel. One of the big things of the 19th century. If all of this pattern that we're talking about is not complicated enough for you, then we've also got the church structure. I'll come onto that in just a second. Are we ready? People more or less okay? Yeah? Okay. The church. That's another, it's almost like a second pyramid. So you've got the structure of society outside the church, and you've got the church structure. You've got two structures going on together. Or would you put them kind of on top of each other? I don't know how you'd show it, really, because the church structure is a separate, independent structure. Knights might have swords and weapons and power and horses, but they couldn't ride into the church. Okay, the priests had a separate status. So you've got the whole church structure, which in the Middle Ages up until the early 16th century, really, the head of the church was the Pope, of course, in the Catholic Church. And his authority, in theory, was higher even than the king. So we say the highest authority was the king, but inside the church there was the Pope, who would be higher than the king. The king had to bow down before the Pope. Pope, of course, Romaho, if you're not sure. And this was hugely powerful because in the Chuseijidai, people believed, in the Middle Ages, people believed that the purpose of their life was religion. The purpose of their life is to go to heaven, be a good person, go to heaven, or not be a good person and go to hell. So the priests had huge power because people gave big importance to religion. So you could almost say that the religious hierarchy, the religious pyramid structure was almost higher than the secular structure of the society. So the higher ranking clergy had a huge influence, and they had a similar social status to the nobility. So you've got a big group of people whose authority is on the same kind of level as the daimyo kind of class, the nobility. So if we move that forward into the 18th century, well, the feudal system ended really a long time before that. In the middle of the 14th century, there had been a plague called the Black Death, and about half of Europe was killed by it. Half the population of Europe died in the Black Death. So it was a terrible, terrible time. And this destabilized the pattern of life. The social structure broke down. When you've got people dying all over the place, that just is going to change the whole social structure. But even until the 17th century, you can still see some aspects of the feudal system continuing in England. And then in the 18th century, you've got the same basic idea of three social classes: the gentry, which is the high class nobles, the merchant classes, and labourers. Those are the three main categories during the 18th century. But just like the Middle Ages were more complicated, so the reality here is more complicated than just three classes. If we take a look at the Gentry. Basic quality of the gentry was they're so rich they don't need to work. We don't easily think these days that some people don't need to work. I suppose some people are. Even the richest people, they got rich by working, right? We mostly think. But in those days, rich people basically, no, they didn't work. They inherited wealth, they inherited land, they inherited investments. So it went from their parents to the children, and from the children to the grandchildren. It just went through the family for generations. You have these very, very rich families that give their wealth to the next generation. The only work they really did was in government. We talked about the politicians, the House of Lords, a little bit, the political system. In the 18th century, the House of Lords would still be one of... these days, we still have a House of Lords in our Parliament, but it's not very powerful. Even in my lifetime, it's lost its power. It's losing more and more power all the time. Because people say, why should people have political power just because their daddy was rich? Okay, people feel that's not suitable. So the House of Lords has got less and less and less in its power, and the House of Commons, which is the people who are voted, they are the main political power. But in the 18th century, the House of Lords was still very powerful. And most of the members of Parliament came from that gentry class. Now, this is something people find a little bit difficult to understand, but social class was not just money. Some of the merchant, middle-class people might be much, much richer than some of the high-class gentry. But the gentry would look down on them because they worked for their money. It didn't come through inheritance. So it was actually kind of gehin to work and get your money by working. All right, the respected thing was your money comes from your daddy and your granddaddy, and it's been in your family for hundreds of years. That was the respected high-class thing. So it wasn't just the money, it was coming from the money was coming from your family, and it was a good family, or good. They considered those high-class families good. People like Mr. and Mrs. Andrews in this painting by Gainsborough in the middle of the 18th century, they didn't work. They would have huge acres of land, areas of land like this, and they'd live on the profit that came from farming and renting properties on that land. So you can see the fields of sheep, you can see the corn, you can even see buildings in the distance. There would be whole villages that were part of their property. Every single villager would pay them money as rent. Okay, so there'd be the chintai, the rent on the houses in the village. There would be, the farmers would grow this food. They would have to give a percentage to them. The sheep, everything, a percentage would go to them. And it just came year after year. All they had to do was manage the money, put it in the bank, spend it. They didn't have to work for it. But not everybody from a high-class family was necessarily going to be rich. You see, the system was to give all the property to the eldest son. This system means that the property keeps together in one piece, one estate. It was called an estate. And the elder son would get everything. Why does Rochester marry Bertha Mason in Jane Eyre? Do we know? Why does Rochester marry Bertha? Has anybody read Jane Eyre? No, no, shaking our head. Oh, no, we don't know that stuff. Okay, it's all right. Rochester is a good example. He is Niban Meno Musuko. He's the second son. So big brother gets everything, next brother gets nothing. So in this case, the family says, go and marry this rich woman from Jamaica. She's got money. And then you don't have to worry about your life anymore. Marry a rich woman. So that was one answer. Okay, the second son could marry a rich woman. But typically, the second son would go into the army as a commissioned officer. Now, today, when you take a job, they pay you. In those days, you would buy your job if it was a good job. You would buy your job. So Daddy would buy you a position in the army. Not just an ordinary soldier. Okay? Inside the army hierarchy, he would buy you a high up position. You would be an officer, you would be a high-level army official because Daddy bought it for you. So that was one way that they looked after the second son. Buy a position in the army, high up, for your son, for your second son. And then the next son would typically enter the church. And this again is the same thing. Buy a position in the church which will put your son reasonably high up on the hierarchy. It won't put him at the top, okay? It'll put him somewhere around here, in the middle area, but it will give the son, the third son, a status in the society. In an English village in the 18th, 19th century, there were 3 people whose status was guaranteed. The school teacher, the doctor, and the church vicar. Those positions could all be bought. All right, the school teacher was the one that was least likely to be bought. All right, people would give it to well-qualified people without them paying to have that position. But positions in 18th, 19th century England, you had to buy your position. If you were going to be a doctor, you would have to buy your position to get the training. So you were like learning. I suppose we learn in universities. So then when we begin the job, we've had some training. They would buy their position, for example, the law. They would buy a position in a company. The company would train them up. They would take exams, university exams, and they would get a license. And then they would start making money. Okay? But even jobs that were not so high level, for example, like I said, making shoes for horses and making metal things. In Charles Dickens's novel Great Expectations, the little boy Pip has to buy a position to train to do that job. from his brother. Okay, actually the brother loves Pip and it's his uncle. Sorry, uncle. His sister's uncle them or their brother-in-law, Gimono, okay, brother, because his sister has married this man, and that's his job. He's a blacksmith, and Pip ends up somebody pays for him to get the training to do that job. And so many jobs in those days, people would pay to be able to start the job. So family privilege and family money were very important in social class. If your parents can't pay, you want to join the army, you just go in at the bottom as a normal soldier. And it's a tough life. So these positions, the church and the army, were typical for high-class sons who were not the first son, the second and third son. So the people who had those positions, they wouldn't be hugely rich, but they would be respected even though they didn't have huge amounts of money. They were respected because they came from high-class families and they were in respected positions in the army or in the church. So social class is not just about money. It's something really important to understand in those days. The daughters of high-class parents would get wealth by marrying someone rich. Basically, when a young woman is looking for a husband, one of the big things the family is saying, is he rich? Is he rich? Marry somebody rich. Marry somebody high-class and rich. And again, those marriages could be bought. The system of a dowry where the parents will give money to the family of the parents of the daughter, the girl's parents, will give money to the man's family. And then after that, the man will look after her. So they kind of buy their way, again, people are buying their way into a position. So money is part of it, but money is not the only thing in determining people's social class. Okay. Well, there were high-born people who could fall through this system and end up in a lower position in society. Suppose an old high-class family loses all its money. Then the family is not quite low class, but they're not high class anymore. There are one or two characters like that in Jane Austen's works. Everybody feels kind of kawaiso, and they're not treated like low class people. They're high class people, but they've lost all their money. So they still get kind of invited along, but it's more like kawaiso. They're kind of part of the rich high class community, but they are actually poor. So the society had to kind of cope with people like, for example, if a woman didn't find a husband, she'd end up as an old maid. She wasn't married. There was no money, or very little money. But she was from a good family. And also there was social mobility in the other direction. Middle-class people could rise up in status, and if you have the new rich, the nouveau riche, if it's one nouveau riche, it's okay, nouveau riche. If it's more than one, it's plural, like that. It's French. So nouveau riche is the plural with the X and the S at the end. And a high-class family would always say, oh, well, he's worked for his money, but his son is handsome, and our daughter likes him, and she will be comfortable, she will be rich, and in this way, a middle-class family could kind of rise up and improve its position by marrying into one of the old high-class families. So the new rich, okay, were looked down on, but sometimes if they were able to marry into an old family, they would increase their statement in various ways. And during this period, you've got the middle classes, you've got more and more middle class people kind of moving up, because this is an age of opportunity. In the 18th century, especially with the slave trade and generally with trading, people could make a fortune. And they would be then wanting not just to be rich, but they'd be wanting to be high class. So the upper class had like a problem of what do we do with them? We are we've got our beautiful house, we're high class, we're rich, and we've got our beautiful house, huge beautiful house, and it's been there for 200 years, 300 years. And suddenly, a new family has come. They've built a house near us. It's even bigger than our house. It's even more beautiful than our house. Doshio. Should we invite them to our coffee party? Should we invite them to tea? Should we, accept them or not? Okay? And it's very interesting how in 18th and 19th century England, they would decide, yes, let's accept them and let's bring them in to our community. Or no, they've got money, but they are gehi. And they could be accepted if they had good manners and if they had good taste. But most of all, they could be accepted if they spoke the right English. Hogen de hanashite itara dame. Okay? If they were speaking in a local accent, basically, they would be out. And even today, we talk about RP, received pronunciation. They would be received, they would be accepted, they would be invited to the coffee parties, they would be invited to the dances, they would be invited to the dinners, because they spoke the right way. I mean, you know what I'm talking about? Like if they talk like there was Cockney, rong dong beng day anashtaitara. Okay, if they talk like that, they wouldn't get invited, okay? People would say they have money, but they don't have any culture because of their way of speaking. And like if they spoke in broad Yorkshire accent, come from north of England, like, and talking like this, people would say, oh, well, we can't have them coming to our party. Okay, because it sounded gehin so they developed this kind of English that more or less, even today, we teach. That's what I'm more or less speaking, is this received pronunciation. It's more or less what you're learning. Okay? So it's had a big influence. This is the kind of Johin way of speaking English, more or less. When I was a student 50 years ago or so, it was motto. I mean, people really, they would talk like this. People don't talk like this anymore because people hate people who talk like this. But that was the way that high-class people used to talk. All right? Well, you don't hear that so much now. All right? That's not fashionable. So what we normally hear now is what they call modified RP. So it doesn't have a local accent, but it's not that kind of very snobbish sounding way of speaking. So we can still see that the way English people or British people speak is very important to how people think about their social status. It's still an important aspect. And educated English all over the world is connected to RP. Possibly worth having a little bit of explanation about this because it's quite culturally important. If you look at language variation, all these pens that don't really work. If you look at language variation on a pyramid kind of pattern, at the base of the pyramid, the language varies much more. And if you look at social class, at the top of the social class, there's not much difference in language. At the bottom, you've got much more variation in language. And this would be true if you go to America, it would be true if you go to Jamaica, it would be true all around the world. So the higher people's social class, the less variation in language, the lower the social class, the more you've got this variation in language. Okay, what's happening here? Like this. The more social class and education you've got, the more you've got, higher up you get, like up here, you've got less, sorry, I've forgotten that I put this on the, putting it up there as well. You've got the higher social class and higher education has less language variation, whereas lower has more. So as I say, if you go to Scotland, you'll hear an educated Scottish person would be talking something like Professor McGonagall in the Harry Potter movies. You can hear that she's Scottish. She's got a Scottish accent. But it's a very educated Scottish accent. Okay? Whereas a student last week was talking to me about a class that she's doing here at the university where they were studying the speech of people in Glasgow. They don't say school, they say skill. My kid goes to skill. My child goes to school. Skill. All right? They call it skill. Okay? They don't say school. That would be kind of lower class here. And if you go to the streets of Glasgow and listen to people in Scotland, I can't understand those people. Okay? If I'm in Cambridge and I'm in the university, people will say, I'm going home. Receive pronunciation. But if I go out onto the streets of Cambridge, especially in the villages around Cambridge, they say, Om gun home. Om gun home is I'm going home. All right? If I go to London, then they'll be saying, I'm going home. Okay, I'm going home. All right? If I go to my Furusato, Newcastle, they say, going hjem. Big language variation inside England. Okay? Cambridge, London, Newcastle, very different way of speaking. But the educated speakers in London and Newcastle and Cambridge will all be saying, I'm going home, or something very similar. So language variation as you go up the social scale is much less. Okay? All right then, so middle classes of the 18th century, there's also a lot of variety among them, because you've got the merchant classes who are getting their money through buying and selling goods or services or slaves or whatever it might be. But you've also got the professions. Society is getting much more specialized. Doctors, lawyers, architects, engineers, all of these people are needed in an advanced society. So those people are becoming increasingly an upwardly mobile section of the society. And they needed for every doctor or lawyer or architect, you need a secretary, you need a clerk, you need people who are going to do the the administrative work. And depending on how much training or responsibility they had, they might be considered working class or they might be considered lower middle class. And it wouldn't make a difference how much they got paid. If it was a job that required very little training and responsibility, even if the pay was higher, they would be working class. Some of the middle class jobs paid less money than the working class jobs. Okay? So the middle class has got a lot of variety in it as well. And then we've got the working classes, the labouring classes, who again, they could be skilled craftsmen or they could be unskilled workers. They could be smallholders who have their own land, or they could be subsistent farmers who have no rights of ownership to the land. So again, among the working class, there'd be big differences. Very often, the main barrier for them would be education, the fact that they could not get an education. There were very few schools before the Industrial Revolution for the lower classes. The chances of a lower class person getting an education were not good. There were some schools, but there was no national system. So if you were lucky, there might be, in one town, there might be a rich man who died and felt sorry for the orphans in the town. So that rich man would say, I'll give some money for a school for the orphans of our town. But the next town, 5-10 miles away, there's no school. So if you're in the next town, you're just not lucky. So you could be lucky. Jane Eyre is lucky. There's a school that she can go to. But for many children in Jane Eyre's position, they may not get an education. She was also lucky that she had a rich aunt who would look after her. And then the Industrial Revolution pushed, as we learned, it pushed a lot of people off the land and into the cities, and they'd be working in factories, they'd be working in mines, digging out coal. And again, we learned this before, but England was the first country in which more people lived in the towns than in the countrysides, in the countryside. And so machines were taking over the production of things that had been produced by hand previously. The old skills that people had were no longer useful. They needed new skills. And education now starts to take off in a more general kind of way. Although we still don't have a national education system even at this stage. Well, a lot of this class system of the 18th century, so I'm kind of rushing through the print now fairly quickly, was carried over into the 19th century. You got specialized skills, means that you get more people in the middle classes. You get people's rights developing in the 19th century, so that the right to vote gives the middle classes a lot more power from about 1832 onwards. And then in the middle of this, well, in 1867 and 1885, later in the century, the right to vote was extended to nearly all men, although women didn't get the vote until much later. But voting became a basic right of all citizens. But even then, social class was still basically a matter of your job, not your salary. So, however skilled you were, even if you were doing a high class or a highly skilled job like a blacksmith or a metal worker or a craftsman making high quality furniture or anything like that, you were still working class. But if you worked in an office, even if it was less skilled and you were being paid less, you were middle class. And during the Victorian period, you've still got the difference between landed gentry, these people who inherited money from their families, and the high-level professionals, like I say, the doctors, the lawyers, those kinds of people. But as time goes by, the difference starts to get less. So a high-class lawyer, a high-class doctor is almost as respected, or can be as respected, as somebody whose money comes from their family and is inherited. So by the middle of the Victorian period, the lines are getting less clear. And more, the gentry were finding it's not so easy as it used to be. In the 18th century, if you invested your money, daitai hosho de, you would get 10%. For a large part of the 18th century, 10% mai toshi, okay, they would get 10% of their basic, the risoku would be 10% on their investment, the return, the profit. So they would just put the money in the bank, and every year it would grow by 10% for a large part of the 18th century. Middle of the 19th century, it's not like that anymore. Things have changed. So they need to get involved in various kinds of professions, for example, banking or buying and selling goods and things like that. And they needed to develop their own education, be good at science or fields of knowledge, or have some product. I mean, you know, you all drink Earl Grey tea, or you know about Earl Grey tea. Okay, well, in the 18th century, Earl Grey would just have been a very rich gentleman. By the time of the 19th century, he starts thinking, what can I do to make money? Oh, I know, my wife's famous tea. I'll market it. Okay, so they're starting to need to get money in more practical ways.